market for any kind of service or support. So if you are using software in your business and you want good support, you have a choice of people to go to for it. You have a choice of businesses that are in the business of providing you with support. So they're going to have to, in general, give you good support or you'll go to somebody else. With proprietary software, support is a monopoly. There's one company typically that has the source code and only they can give you support. So typically you're at the mercy of a monopoly. That's the case, for example, with Microsoft. So no wonder the support is so bad.
The benefits of free software were tremendous, but the cost of supporting it internally made managers very, very nervous. And so the fundamental idea I had was if we could build a model that could deliver 2 to 4 times the support and hand-holding capability that an internal engineer could provide, and we could do it at 1/2 to 1/4 the cost, that would meet the test of whether or not people would actually buy. And by about the fall of that year, we had all of the things worked out about who we needed on the technical team, what the terms of the sale would be, what the key price points were, and we actually received our incorporation in November of 1989. One of the most difficult things in starting our company was actually finding a name for it. I explained this to one of my friends. We were having difficulty, and he returned an email message that basically just had a bunch of words with the name GNU in it. And Cygnus was the one that looked least obnoxious and least obscene.
I can say very clearly that Cygnus was the first business that specialized in free software. Cygnus supported free software, filled a very essential niche because we had this great software, you could get it for nothing, but you couldn't get support, and they made their money by charging for support.
The GNU project started by building a toolkit of basic development tools such as a C compiler, a debugger, a text editor, and other necessary apparatus. And their intention was eventually to develop a kernel to sit underneath those and be the center of the operating system. By about 1990, they had successfully developed that toolkit, and it was in wide use on a great many variants of Unix, but there was still no free kernel.
The kernel happened to be one of the last things we started to do, and we had started it not long before. And that's when Linus Torvalds came along.
Linus or Linus? What's your preferred pronunciation?
When I speak Swedish, it's Linus. When I speak Finnish, it's Linus. When I speak English, it's Linus. And I really don't care how people pronounce my name. But Linux is always Linux.
He developed a kernel and got it working faster than we got ours working, and got it to work very nicely and solidly. His kernel is called Linux.
The initial goal was my very personal goal, to be able to run a similar environment on my computer that I had grown used to at the university computers. And I could not find anything that suited me for that, right? So having been doing computers for all my life, basically, at that point I just decided that I'll do my own. Most of the inspiration early on came from Sun OS, which was what I was using at the university at the time.
Which university?
University of Helsinki in Finland.
From 1991 to about 1993 was really, I guess, the infancy period of Linux. That was when it was still only alpha or beta quality. It was relatively unstable, although even then it was a good deal more stable than a lot of what are now called production operating systems.
Linus used the traditional tried and true method of writing one program that does the job, and he got it to work quickly, in fact, faster than I would have thought was possible.
The term for it is monolithic, which means that basically the OS itself is one entity, indivisible, while in a microkernel, the operating system kernel is actually just a collection of servers that do different things, and then they have a common protocol for doing communication between themselves.
So why is it that if the GNU project had so much lead time, so to speak, doing this, why is it that he was able to kind of come in at the tail end, so to speak?
Well, we actually started the GNU herd not long before he started Linux. And as it happened, though, we chose a design that's a very advanced design in terms of the power it gives you, but also turns out to be very hard to debug. We decided to divide up the kernel, which traditionally had been one program, to divide it up into a lot of smaller programs that would send messages to each other asynchronously to communicate. And the problem is that that style of programming has a great deal of potential for bugs, which are often very hard to figure out because they depend on, does this program send this message before or after this one sends that message? And the result was, it took us years to get the thing to work.
What is Linux's relationship to the GNU project?
Well, there's relationships to GNU on kind of multiple levels. One is just the philosophical level of thinking that making your source open is a good idea.
When Linus developed the kernel, he wasn't doing it for the GNU project. He did it independently. And he released it independently, and we didn't know about it, but some of the people who did know about it decided to look for what else they could find to put together with that kernel to make a whole system. And they looked around, and lo and behold, everything they needed was already available. What good fortune, they thought, but actually there was no chance about it. They had found all the pieces of the GNU system, which was missing just the kernel. So when they put all that together, really they were fitting Linux into the gap in the GNU system, but they didn't know that.
There's a lot of these programs done by the Free Software Foundation and done by other people like Linux, and there's a symbiosis between Linux and the programs, so that the programs run on Linux and at the same time, and they take advantage of Linux as a platform, while Linux takes advantage of the programs by just being able to use them.
What programs?
For the main one is actually the GNU C compiler, which without a C compiler it would not have been possible to make Linux or most of the open programs available. Linux uses the GPL, and I agree with the kind of philosophy behind the GPL. That said, the GPL itself is not a very pretty document, which is probably just because no lawyers can ever be very pretty.
Well, I'd been playing around with Linux for actually late 92, early 93 for about a year before I decided it was to the point where it actually had everything that I needed to really replace the Sun workstation. And I was looking for a way to have a Unix workstation at home. At the time, we used Sun SPARC stations in the office at Stanford. Those machines cost us about $7,000. Now, I desperately wanted a Unix machine at home. There's always this thought you get as a graduate student, gee, if I could work at home, then I would be so much more productive. I would graduate sooner because I would finish my thesis sooner. Well, is it true? Well, you can judge, you know. Most people end up spending a lot of their time becoming more productive so that if they ever actually worked on their thesis, they'd finish it in a day. It takes a while sometimes. So I decided I wanted a Unix machine at home. And I went out there and was able to use Linux together with a PC. For about $2,000, I put together a system that was 1.5 to 2 times faster than that $7,000 Sun SPARC station. That was absolutely amazing. I had 1.5 to 2 times the speed at 1/3 to 1/4 the price. Light bulbs went off. I knew there was an opportunity here. This was a chance to really do something better than what Sun has done around open source and Linux.
I called it Linux originally as a working name, and that was just because Linus, and the X has to be there. It's Unix. I mean, it's like a law. And what happened was that I initially thought that I can't call it Linux publicly because it's just too egotistical, and that was before I had a big ego, right?
They thought they were taking a whole bunch of components and putting them around Linux. So they ended up calling the whole thing a Linux system, and somehow that term caught on, and the result is there are now 10 million people using this variant of the GNU system, the GNU/Linux operating system, and most of them don't know it.
Some people advocate that it be described as GNU/Linux. I mean, what's your thought on that? Is that justified, or?
Well, I think it's justified, but it's justified if you actually make a GNU distribution of Linux. The same way that I think that Red Hat Linux is fine, or SUSE Linux, or Debian Linux. Because if you actually make your own distribution of Linux, you get to name the thing. But calling Linux in general GNU Linux, I think, is just ridiculous.
I got involved in Fall '93 because I was sent a copy of the first CD-ROM commercial Linux distribution, which was called Yggdrasil. It was produced by Adam Richter. And I got a copy because I had been myself writing free software for a long time, since the early 80s. I was actually one of the early GNU contributors myself. And I was absolutely astonished. I was completely astonished because I'd been a software engineer for nearly 15 years at that point, and according to all the rules I knew about controlling complexity, keeping your project groups small, having closely managed objectives, Linux should have been a disaster, and it wasn't. Instead, it was something wonderful, and I was determined to figure out how they were getting away with that.
In order for Linux to grow beyond the world of the computer programmer, it needed a use, an application that made it a must-have technology. That threshold was crossed with the development of a program that made complex websites possible. That program is the Apache Web Server.
The killer app of Linux was undoubtedly the Apache Web Server. If you look at the history of Linux, the adoption curve of Linux and the adoption curve of the Internet exactly track each other. 1993, which was when the Apache Web Server project really got started, was also the beginnings of the popular ISP explosion, when the Internet first became a mass market commodity and the idea of web-based electronic commerce and mass communication became real.
I think it was one of the first applications that caused people to go, wow, if I install Linux, I get some tangible benefit from doing so, right? I mean, clearly there were a lot of interesting applications on Linux at the time, this being maybe 2 or 3 years ago when this thing really started to take off. But there wasn't a driving, you could almost say business case for someone to use Linux versus using NT until, I think, Apache. And a lot of the things that plugged into Apache and enhanced Apache. I mean, when you went to go out and build a server farm, it was much more cost-effective, real dollar terms, to build it on Linux and Apache than it was to build it on IIS and NT, even if it meant that you had to spend a little bit of money to train your staff to learn how to use that or to find people who were knowledgeable. But the good news was that that knowledge wasn't very expensive because there are all these college students out there who have been using Linux for a long time and were very familiar with it.
If you look at the trend curves in web servers, Apache has steadily been gaining in market share ever since. It's up to something like 66% now. It's steadily clobbered all of the closed source competition. And that's because it's more reliable, it's more flexible, it's more extensible. It does what webmasters actually need. And the combination of Apache and Linux found its way into a great many commercial shops.
Essentially, Apache became the application that motivated internet service providers and e-commerce companies to choose Linux over Microsoft's Windows.
It would probably run best on Linux and on FreeBSD, and the reason is the communities around those operating systems are also the communities that contribute the most back to Apache, right? And they were also the operating systems that internet service providers started using very heavily as well. And internet service providers really liked Apache because it allowed them to do a lot of different things that some of the commercial web servers didn't, such as the ability to host more than one website on a single box, which clearly if you're an ISP and you have 40,000 users and they all want their own website is going to be pretty important to you.
One of the key factors in the growth of Linux was the creation of companies that specialized in the distribution and support of the operating system itself. Among these companies, Red Hat Software is the best known.
Red Hat started as the product of Mark Ewing. While he was working at IBM, he wanted a little better better Linux distribution. He started playing around, found out he spent more time maintaining his Linux distribution than he did working on his new project. So he sort of started the distribution itself. He met up with Bob Young, who at the time was running a company called ACC Bookstore, which was a mail-order PC Unix catalog. And Bob kind of knew he wanted something, more his own to market rather than reselling other people's products. And he was fairly good at marketing, and Mark knew he needed some marketing help because he was fairly good at the technical part, so they kind of got together. I started working with Red Hat in May of 1995, basically right out of NC State, along with Eric Trowan, who me and him combined make up employees number 4 and 5. And we actually reported to work at an apartment that Mark Ewing used to live in. We took it over as kind of the development part of Red Hat software, and stayed that way till about November of 1995, when a toilet we had in the apartment kind of exploded, flooded our downstairs neighbor, and she got a little upset, and the apartment folks found out we were running a business there instead of actually living there at the same time, so they decided to throw us out. So at that point, we had about a week to go find our first office, which we did, and get ourselves moved in a hurry. So.
We started going in, again, 95 or so to the venture capital firms, saying, there's something happening here. There's a great business opportunity to build the next Sun for open source. Well, the venture capitalists looked at this and said, gee, you're selling systems, the software's free, this is kind of scary. We're not sure that we want to put money in. And by the way, we funded other systems companies, and it hasn't really panned out. We're scared.
I came to the U.S. about 3 years ago, and the reason really was that I'd been spending like 6 or 7 years at Helsinki University and decided that it was time to see the real world and not just university life. Especially this area had a lot of the most interesting work being done. So I just decided that let's try to move halfway across the world and give this a try, and it's turned out pretty well.
Do you see this as temporary or long-term?
Well, we saw it as temporary at first, and I think it's certainly looking like it's turning long-term. Our youngest daughter is both a U.S. and a Finnish citizen because she was born here, and the older one is speaking both Swedish and English, so.
The next major event was one that I had a direct hand in. I wrote a paper called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which was my observations, my anthropological analysis of what it was that made the open source world work. We didn't call it that then. We were still using the term free software primarily. So it was my observation of what made the free software world work and why we were able to produce extremely high quality software in spite of constantly violating all of the standard rules of software engineering. In that paper, I was setting up a contrast between two different styles of development, two opposed styles of development. One, which is the conventional closed development style, which I called the cathedral style. In that one, you have tight specification of objectives, small project groups which are run in a fairly hierarchical, authoritarian manner, and you have long release intervals. On the other hand, what I identified as happening in the Linux world was a much more peer-to-peer, decentralized market or bazaar-like style in which you have very short release intervals and constant solicitation of feedback from people who are formally outside the project, a very intense peer review process. And the startling thing was that the more I looked at this, the more it seemed that trading away all the supposed advantages of conventional closed development for that one single advantage of massive independent peer review actually seemed to win, actually seemed to get you good results.
The reason Netscape is important is that they were the first large company to participate in open source. We had Cygnus providing support, but we didn't really have much business. And Netscape went to open source essentially as a way to fight Microsoft, which was giving away Internet Explorer, but not letting anyone else have the source code, not letting companies collaborate.
Working as part of the sales force, I got a good idea of why people bought our software and what it took to make our software successful in the marketplace against competitive products. However, the problem we were seeing is that as time went on, our software was being competed against by other people's software, particularly Microsoft's. And as time went on, the price of our software had to drop because other people were giving their software away at no charge or at little charge.
Now, the real problem was that they feared that Microsoft would achieve a monopoly lock on the browser market, and they would then use that monopoly lock to pervert, actually, the HTTP and HTML standards that the web depends on. And once they had turned those standards into lock-in devices, they could then use that control to drive Netscape out of the server market.